Welcome, fellow explorers. My name is Christian Alexanderson, and this is Hemlocks to Hellbenders, a podcast highlighting Pennsylvania's parks, forests, and great outdoors. When people think about history, especially armed conflicts, many picture dusty textbooks, old maps, and long-forgotten generals. But here in Pennsylvania, history isn't just words on a page. It's written into the very ground beneath our feet. From the rolling hills of Gettysburg, where the fate of a nation turned in just 3 days, to the banks of the Brandywine, where the Revolutionary War nearly lost its footing, to the quiet frontier where settlers clashed in the Whiskey Rebellion, Pennsylvania has been a crossroads for some of the most important struggles in American history. In fact, you can't tell the history of America without looking at the battles that scar Pennsylvania's landscape. When hatchets, arrows, bullets, swords, and cannons left thousands of dead bodies on what was once peaceful forests and fields. It's also true that you can't tell the stories of Pennsylvania's parks, forests, and public lands without looking at the battles that shaped our history. Places like Point State Park, Washington Crossing State Park, and Fort Necessity National Battlefield are just a couple of the public lands that we enjoy and appreciate today. Not to mention places like Colonel Denning State Park, Francis Slocum State Park, and Ricketts Glen State Park, which are named after influential service members and survivors of battles. The very parks we visit, trails we hike, and sites we explore have meaning, and it's important that we know about these hallowed grounds. Now, I understand that history isn't for everyone, but I think it's all in how you learn about it. History isn't just about battle lines, troop movements, and bloody war stories. It's so much more than that. It's about ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, immigrants, and families whose lives were upended by battles happening in their backyards. It's about how communities responded to chaos, how a landscape carried on the memory of those lost, and how the echoes of cannon fire shaped the Pennsylvania we live in today. So even if you don't think you're a quote-unquote history person, stick around, because the battles that happen here aren't just about the past. They're about understanding the public lands we have right now. I'm excited to welcome Brady Crytzer to the podcast. Brady teaches history at Robert Morris University and is the author of several books about Pennsylvania history. Brady, thanks so much for joining the program.
Thank you, Christian. Thanks for having me.
What is it about Pennsylvania's battles throughout history that's intrigued you?
You know, the draw for me has always been that we drive through these places every day, maybe going to work, maybe going to a park, wherever. We see them and we kind of, we get lost in our day to day. I always like the history of it because it really lets you realize that things happened before. It makes you almost look at where you live in a different way, which is such an amazing experience. And for me, I want to share that with people. So, you're never more than 20 or 30 minutes from a historic site anywhere in the Commonwealth. Probably never more than an hour or so from a battlefield, if that's your particular interest. And we just have so many here in Pennsylvania. It's one of the great resources here in the Commonwealth, I think.
I know I've run into these people a lot. I'm sure you have run into these people a lot. If someone told you, I've never been a history person, or I'm just not that interested in history, how would you try to change their mind or maybe offer a different perspective of why they could be interested in history?
I think, and this may be me being an optimist, but I think deep down, it's a very human thing to be grabbed by history. We just come to it in different ways. So like for me, I had a wonderful teacher, a professor when I was in college that kind of showed me that when I was 18. It really changed my career path, as it were. But I find that, as we age, I think we start to be a little more introspective. We start to think about history more. So there's that line for everybody. Maybe people don't know what history is. Maybe they think it's just battlefields. It's food history, it's fashion history, it's literary history, it's conservation history. There's some interest they have. And for me, the job is always find that connection for people. And most of the time, I think I can at least make a case for history, if not pique their interest, outright.
Why do you think stories from the past, especially battles, still matter to people today?
Battles, I always say this, battles are like scars. Scars on the landscape, scars in our national consciousness. They remind us that the past is real and authentic, and these things really happened. Even when the world moves on, those battlefields remain. But I always want to remind people, battles are not something necessarily to celebrate. Most of the time, life is peaceful for people. If you're having a battle, something's gone pretty terribly wrong for the most part. So we don't want more battles. We'll be good if all of our battlefields, if we stop producing those now. But they matter because, again, depending on the war, the circumstance, People gave their lives for a cause, and it's usually political. And it kind of reminds us that we're still working on this, I think, American experiment. Nothing's secure. That's why we have elections every year. We're always reshaping it and trying to alter it to kind of fit the needs of the time. So battlefields are to me just that reminder that these things happened and they mattered. And I think most importantly, they were a step toward who we are today.
What makes Pennsylvania such a significant stage for battles in American history? What is it about us?
I think a lot of it honestly goes back to William Penn. And I could talk at length about William Penn in the 1680s, but William Penn did something no one else in the world did. And it was he made a colony. He was given this colony by the king to shape kind of as his own private fiefdom. He wanted to make a place where any people of any race or religion or background could live and express those sort of qualities of their life freely. I mean, religious freedom just didn't happen anywhere else in the world. So because of that, even by 1700, we have Scots Irish Presbyterians, Native Americans of all nations. We have English Quakers. We have Anglicans. We have West African Muslims. We have Ashkenazic Jews, French Catholics. They're all coming to Pennsylvania because they can live as they please as free people. And that really made us kind of the first melting pot. But that's a little bit of a pie in the sky view because they obviously didn't all get along. Um, and I think that kind of religious ethnic diversity blooms into political diversity, and people don't always agree with each other, which I think at the core is what makes Pennsylvania such a right place for these sort of events. Even in the Civil War, that was a political event. You had pro-Confederate Pennsylvanians for different reasons. So we were always the place where people mixed. We're kind of in the middle between North and South, and we're still kind of a purple state politically, and that's nothing new. That's the norm.
It sounds funny to think that because William Penn set up an area that was accepting that naturally caused problems.
Right.
Just because people were like, well, sure, I want to celebrate or I want to have my culture, my religion here. Why should blah 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 down the street be able to do the same thing?
Yeah, Benjamin Franklin was, born in New England, but he came to Philadelphia fairly early in his life, and he was just beside himself at the amount of German immigrants coming to Pennsylvania. They were Anabaptists, like the Mennonites and the Amish, and he actually wrote in his newspaper, "Someday, if we don't stop this immigration, our school children will have to learn in German. Our road signs will be in German." Today he would say he would worry that people would have to press two for English and one for
Yeah.
German and something
Hmm.
like that. It's just it's so much still us, but I think that gets to the heart of it.
American Indians had long lived in Pennsylvania before Europeans ever arrived. What do we know about warring tribes in Pennsylvania? What did they fight over? What were the main issues they were trying to resolve?
Their primary issues were really even still our primary issues, which were economics and cultural divides. They had an economic system that was very diverse based on trade long before Europeans ever came to North America. There were wealthy nations. Usually use the word tribes. If, in my field, we've kind of gotten away from that because it's not exactly the right word. So we'll say nations. There were wealthy nations and poorer nations. There were nations that ruled over others. When Europeans came, they began paying really huge amounts of money in terms of goods for furs. And these native nations realized if they could monopolize fur and the fur trade, they could become fabulously rich. So the most powerful native nation really in the whole Northeast were the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois. They were very much, in my opinion, like an empire. They came down here. They were based in New York into Pennsylvania, and they just I use this word very carefully. I mean, they just unleashed the dogs of war on all these smaller tribes. They killed many, many people, which led to, I mean, wasn't, intertribal national wars in the 1600s just to monopolize the fur trade. So they're very much like their European neighbors. When it came down to it, it was about dollars and cents.
I'm fortunate enough to live in the Susquehanna Valley where so much of this history takes place. I started only the past year or so reading a lot more books and trying to study up and learn about these different nations and what was the cause of war and what was the things like it. I feel really fortunate that Pennsylvania is able to have that history and be able to learn about it because so many different nations came through this area.
Yes.
So to be able to like see and understand and learn about their culture is just so fascinating to me.
And it takes a lot of work. Remember, native peoples didn't really have written sources. I did a biography on a Native American chief named Guyasuta here in Western Pennsylvania. He probably spoke a dozen languages, but a written component just wasn't one of them. So when we want to learn about them, and this is why it's so important, maybe I could recruit some people into the field here. There's just a few people like me doing this. We have to kind of read European accounts of interactions with native peoples and try and glean what we can from their lives because they didn't really leave much themselves. But I think we're getting better at that. But we do need more people working in the field, though.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I was surprised about were how many texts from missionaries there were
Yes.
that can be used to really get a European understanding, at least, of what was going on and what was happening in that time period.
Yeah, you hit on something really important, Christian, which we don't think about, but everyone has a practical reason for interacting with a native nation. And for missionaries, they're trying to preach whatever their particular religion is. They had to learn the native languages to do that. They weren't there to exploit the native peoples or steal from them. They were there to convert them. So before they could do that, they had to earn their trust. And the way they did that was by ingraining themselves in the native world. So missionaries, they weren't out there trying to leave this huge paper trail for us 250 years later, but that's what they did.
Pennsylvanians and American Indians fought throughout the time the colony was established. Are there any moments of conflict that stand out in your mind?
Honestly, from the 1680s onward, it's depending where you look, a perpetual conflict. When William Penn came here, he truly wanted to build a colony for everyone, and he treated native peoples very well. They called him Brother Onus. Onus was their word for a feather because he signed everything with a quill pen, and they had a good relationship. But when William Penn left the colony, his children weren't so benevolent. In 1737, they stole a huge amount of land from the Lenapes who lived in the Delaware River Valley. And I use that word stole very carefully because I don't throw that around a lot. But they made an agreement in 1737. We'll just take as much land as a man can walk in a day. And the Delawares, the Lenapes, they said, okay, we can agree to that. Can't do too much damage. Well, they had 3 long distance marathon runners come out, and they took literally tens of thousands of acres in one day, most of eastern PA, in fact.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the start. That's when the natives here in Pennsylvania realized William Penn was a great man we could trust. Those days are done. And I think from 1737 really until 1796, it's perpetual war. And that's a long time.
And how often throughout history are the good men set up to be able to build a reputation only for their kids to really destroy?
Right. It's over. Yeah. Even still today, even in small businesses, right?
Absolutely.
Government postings. History is so much, the takeaway I always get is, boy, we haven't changed much at all.
Yeah.
And I think that's inevitably where you end up.
I think that's why I love reading history so much. I mean, I got a minor in history by accident because I took so many college courses in history. And they were like, oh, you have a minor. And I was like, oh, I was just taking stuff I found interesting. I had no idea I was supposed to take like yoga my senior year. But it really helps you understand humans and human nature. I think the study of history, of just looking at people and be like, we've been doing this forever. It's never, I mean, you could read accounts in Rome, you could read accounts in ancient Greece, wherever you want to go, and you're still going to be like, that sounds like us. That sounds like something we would do.
It always rings familiar. I always tell my students, people say history repeats itself, and those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. I don't necessarily buy into that. As a professional, I've seen that proven wrong too many times, but I always say history is best used like a mirror to reflect on ourselves and our world. And that's always the goal. At the end of my courses, I tell students, we've been talking about the Civil War or the Revolution for a whole semester. the secret is we've actually been talking about the modern world, and you didn't realize it till now. So we've been doing that from day one.
The French and Indian War started right here in Pennsylvania, thanks in part to the actions of a young 21-year-old colonel named George Washington. Can you tell us about the Battle of Jumonville Glen and Fort Necessity?
Sure. So in 1753, the French understand Pennsylvania stopped at the Appalachian Mountains. So Pennsylvania was really everything from basically Carlisle eastward. In 1753, the British and French both claim everything beyond the mountains, the Trans-Appalachian West, and they both have somewhat specious claims to it. None are very strong, but they begin moving into that area. The French build these fortifications in what is today Erie and Franklin, PA, which are really the first European structures built west of the mountains anywhere at that point. Um, and the British are obviously anxious to get them off that land. So they'll send a 21-year-old named George Washington. He's a member of the planter, kind of wealthy elite class of Virginia. And they say, tell these French to get off the land. And obviously, they're not going to do that. So a year later in 1754, Washington returns. And again, he's still British at this point. He loves the British Empire. He's 22 years old. And when he gets to about Uniontown, he's sent again to kind of move into the frontier, build a fort himself. He's intercepted by the French operating out of those forts around Pittsburgh. Um, and they're aided, of course, by their native allies. And he feels like he's going to be outnumbered. So one of his own native allies tells Washington, I know where they'll be camped for the night. Again, this is June or May, rather, of 1754. They're camped on top of Chestnut Ridge, just outside of today Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Washington will lead his Virginians and South Carolinians to attack the French camp. It's a major firefight. What Washington doesn't realize is this is a diplomatic party. You're not allowed to shoot at them. And he just made a big mistake. And that's largely because, number one, he believed they were potentially at war, or at least on a war footing. And number two, his inexperience shone through. So that'll become known as the Battle of Jumonville Glen. And that's part of the National Park System today. We can all go visit it. It sits at the very crest of Chestnut Ridge. That'll lead to a French response. A few weeks later, at a place called the Great Meadows, Washington builds a kind of popsicle stick fort he calls aptly Fort Necessity, and he's beaten pretty badly there. He's outnumbered. It's raining. The men's muskets won't fire. For anyone who hunts in the late flintlock season, you know exactly what that's like. The weather doesn't always cooperate, and he has to surrender. So many people will trace the origins of the French and Indian War to that moment. Now, understand the French and Indian War is a global war. It's fought on 5 continents. It's called the 7 Years' War globally. Our theater in North America is known as the French and Indian War, but that is very much a Pennsylvania story.
Yeah, I find that so fascinating because I always think, did I learn this stuff growing up and I just forgot it? Or am I just now remembering it? Or am I discovering it for the first time? Because when I hear things about, oh, something happened in Pennsylvania, I was growing up in New Jersey. Pennsylvania was a million years away. Who cares about Pennsylvania?
Very different history. Yeah. New Jersey's connected, but
Yeah.
it's also connected to New York, right? It's kind of siphoned into Philly and New York in a way. It loses itself.
Well, that's the great thing about being able to live here is like, oh wow, we have so much history here. Like you could look at any point in history and Pennsylvania has played a major role. To think that a war started because of the actions of somebody that was at that point, it was called the Ohio country, right? Or the Ohio
Western
territory.
Pennsylvania, yeah, the Ohio country,
but which is now Pennsylvania. Just to think that that happened, and you can now visit those sites, like you said, part of the National Park Service. Fort Necessity, they do such a phenomenal job teaching you about why it started, how it started, the importance of an interpreter that maybe wasn't too good or was who might have said something right or said something wrong. The fact that you could go to Jumonville Glen and you could actually hike the trails and see exactly what they're talking about when they're talking about a supposed ambush. You're like, oh, I can see it. Like I can see where they would have been. And
yes,
it's
that's
so
a special
great
place. It's basically unchanged from 54. So I mean, you can go there and feel it. Yeah. It's not like Gettysburg, where it served as a battle encampment in World War I and tanks trained there. I mean, Jumonville Glen is as Washington would have seen it.
Pennsylvania was on the front lines during the French and Indian War. what other parks or battlefields can people go to learn more about this war?
Well, there's a lot. And that's just the one war. So you're probably best to start in the west and work your way east. You have Fort Necessity in Jumonville Glen. They're in southwestern PA in Fayette County. Uh, in 1755, Washington returns. There's a massive battle. He's lucky to survive. That's the Battle of the Monongahela, which is Braddock, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. Fort Pitt, at Point State Park in downtown Pittsburgh, is the site of the French Fort Duquesne, which was their target. Later, Fort Pitt, the British will rebuild there. All the way up, you can go to Waterford, PA, and see where Washington first delivered his letter to ask the French to leave. Erie had a Fort Presque Isle, which was built and then later destroyed, and that's just like the far west. Uh, One of my favorite spots, every little town seemingly has a fort built somewhere. One of my favorite spots is Fulton County, Fort Loudon. Um, that's a great spot. It's a rebuilt fort, but you still see like the mountains towering over you. So there's, yeah, like I said, you're never really anywhere in the state more than an hour or so away from one of these battlefields.
And luckily, a lot of these places have trails that are built and have picnic areas to where you can actually learn and you could talk to educators and things like that, which is what really intrigues me is the fact that there's so many other people interested in this that you could learn so much in so many different places.
Yeah, for sure. And that speaks to our park rangers at the DCNR, because they have to be educated in both historical training, but also conservation, also outdoor recreation. They have to wear a number of different hats, even though they really just wear one hat that we all know. But it's really a testament to them and the fact that when a lot of parks are under threat right now, Pennsylvania is expanding.
Following the end of the French and Indian War, the War of Independence started, splitting families and communities into loyalists for Great Britain and patriots for America. How important was Pennsylvania's role in the American Revolution?
Pennsylvania was really the center of it all. Of course, the Declaration of Independence is written here. We know that, as are the Articles of Confederation and later the Constitution. But Pennsylvania served a lot of different roles in the Revolution. Obviously, Philadelphia was the capital. The Continental Congress had to flee to York for a time. That was the capital. Around Reading, that was where the George Washington's army stored all of their supplies, to feed the Continental Army, essential. Up north, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, that was the breadbasket, the Wyoming Valley of the whole Continental Army. Most of our grain and wheat was grown in that region. When you cross the mountains, Fort Pitt in Pittsburgh was the western headquarters of the whole Continental Army, and it was in control of everything as far south as Kentucky and Illinois on the Ohio River. So we are dead in the center of it. The greatest, in my opinion, commanders of the Continental Army are Pennsylvanians. And we see them just emerge time and time again. And I think it gets back to that original point that Pennsylvania was an attractive place for settlers, which is what led to the French and Indian War, and then, obviously will lead to the American Revolution.
What was it like to be an everyday person in Pennsylvania during that time? How would their lives have been impacted by the war?
That's going to be a great question. That's a lot of the research I'm doing now. And what I would say is it's going to be different between East and West. If you were an Easterner during the American Revolution, um, particularly a Southeasterner, it was, you were in the orbit of Philadelphia. There was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of, comings and goings. Obviously, the British occupied the city for a time. If you lived in the West, it was very different. You were a frontier settler. You were living in a log cabin. In the West, the American Revolution was almost a constant fight every day, but it wasn't against redcoats. It was against British allied native warriors of the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley. There were no battles, but there were almost daily raids. It was a very scary, uncertain time, hyper violent and partisan. You may end up fighting your own neighbor if they remain loyal to the crown. So daily life throughout the war, and understand the war will extend from 1763, if that's when you say kind of the causes begin when people first start talking about it, to 1783 when the Treaty of Paris is signed. It's like anyone living in a war zone. It's extremely uncertain. The economy collapses, unemployment's rampant, there's never enough food, there's no security. So when we see these war-torn places today in the world and we see the struggles of daily life for those people, you still have to live your life. You have to go to school, you have to go to work, and there's a war going on around you. So it's an incredibly difficult time. And here in Pennsylvania, there was never really a break. No one really, the war doesn't go down south into Georgia and South Carolina really until 1778. There's never a time when the action leaves here. It's always in Pennsylvania.
The Battle of Brandywine was an important moment during the American Revolution. Can you tell us about it?
Brandywine was really a low point for George Washington. We always like to say there were moments when it looked like things were slipping through his fingers. That had to be one of them. Brandywine is going to be September of 1777. Um, the British are moving toward Philadelphia, and they completely outfoxed him at that point because what the British wanted to do was put Washington in the unwinnable situation. In Star Trek, they called it the Kobayashi Maru, the unwinnable situation. Uh, if he fought them at one place, then he would have to sacrifice Reading, which was where the Continental Army kept all of their supplies. That would be fatal for his army. If he fought them at another place, he'd have to give up Philadelphia. He couldn't defend both at once. That was the British plan, and they beat him pretty bad at Brandywine. They took Philadelphia, as a matter of fact. Washington elected to protect the supplies smartly.
If you drop someone from today into one of these battles, what would you think would shock them the most?
Um, I think what would shock them the most, and what people, and this is just from me talking to them, is we make the American Revolution a very us versus them dynamic, the Americans versus the British, but it was far closer to a civil war than anything else because Philadelphia remained fairly loyalist throughout the war, and when the British occupied it, they had parties and parades, literally, like celebrating the return to order. The occupation of the Patriots is gone. The rebels, they called them. I think that's what would surprise people. If you looked at Washington's army, there were Native Americans in it. If you looked at the British Army, there were a lot more Native Americans in it. It was a very diverse event. It was politically stratified. Different people fought for different reasons. I think that would be the takeaway is it's not anywhere. It's much messier, I think, than we probably realize today.
What's a story from one of these battles that makes you say you couldn't make this up?
Oh boy. There's, history in a lot of ways is a collection of those things. Um, where would I start with that? Were we talking about the American Revolution?
Yeah.
One of the things I always come back to is the war against Britain for most people ends in 1781 at Yorktown. That's how the story goes that we often hear. But what surprises me is that in 1782, a year after Yorktown, that becomes the most violent year of the whole war. And people out east are celebrating the end. And that's here in the West. Because in 1782, British commanders in Fort Detroit, sensing the war is slipping away, essentially tell the native warriors of the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley, just go do as much damage as you can. Take captives, we'll give you money in exchange for them. Burn every village and settlement you have. So in 1782, it's they call it the Year of Blood. It's the worst year of the war. Hannistown, which is really a rival to Pittsburgh at that time, Hannistown is the seat of Westmoreland County, is completely burned to the ground and never rebuilt. That's what makes Greensburg the county seat, and it's what makes Pittsburgh sort of supreme on the frontier. Every village, every settlement here in the West is raided, under attack, under threat in some way. People out east are like popping champagne, like, hey, we won, and people out west are like, what are you talking about? This is the worst it's ever been. So I think that's what is kind of a story that I always come back to is the Eastern War and the Western War are so different, but they're all critical. And we really have to make sure we're trying to understand both.
And now, let's hear from our sponsors. The Keystone Trails Association presents the 2025 Keystone Hiking and Outdoor Weekend, October 17th to the 19th in the Pennsylvania Wilds. The weekend includes group hikes, river tours, bike rides, forest bathing, and more. KTA welcomes visitors to discover Clarion County and the PA Wilds. To learn more, visit kta-hike.org. Are you looking for your next adventure? Unlock some of the best landscapes in Pennsylvania with incredibly detailed, highly curated, waterproof trail maps from the folks at Purple Lizard. They create extraordinary maps of Pennsylvania state forests for people who love to explore the outdoors. Find them at your local outfitters, bike shops, and bookstores, or visit purplelizard.com, where your next adventure begins. Refresh your love of Pennsylvania state parks and forests with the Pennsylvania Parks and Forest Foundation. Stay in the know by finding events on Meetup or their website, signing up for their weekly e-newsletter, following them on social media, joining a local friends group, or accessing resources online at paparksandforests.org. Together, we can help conserve Pennsylvania's natural resources, support education, and remove barriers to an inclusive outdoor experience for everyone. Looking for a way to add some local Pennsylvania flair to your space? Check out Sister Sunflowers. They create unique stickers inspired by small local spaces that make your community shine. From quirky caves to hidden local gems, their stickers bring your favorite places to life. Perfect for your laptop, water bottle, or anywhere that needs a little hometown love. For both locals and visitors, there's stickers, magnets, prints, and more celebrating Pennsylvania's most iconic parks and forests. And for more avid explorers, there's even a hand-drawn poster to keep track of the Pennsylvania state parks and forests that you've been to. Use the code HELLBENDER15 at checkout to get 15% off your first order. Support local, inspire adventure, and decorate with meaning. Only at Sisters Sunflowers. Shop now and celebrate the places that make your town special. All right, back to the show. There's a number of public lands that highlight important battles and historic moments in Pennsylvania. Do you have any recommendations for people to visit and explore?
I would say it depends. Yes, the answer is yes, of course. See them all if you can. I would say it depends what your interest is. If you are interested in the Continental Army versus the regular British Army, you can really spend a lot of time around Philadelphia viewing a lot of different battles, because every big battle sort of is part of a larger, what we'll call, campaign of smaller battles. And that's true also for the Battle of Gettysburg in the Civil War. So whenever I think about, places I like to see, I like to visit battlefields in connection to one another that tell a greater story. For me, if you go from, say, for example, Lancaster to Carlisle, to Fort Loudon, you get a real sense of the challenge of westward movement, because right at Fort Loudon, the Allegheny Mountains just drape across the landscape. They seem like an impassable obstacle. Then you go follow over the mountains, you arrive at Bedford. There was a fort there, and that goes to Fort Ligonier in Westmoreland County, and that leads to Pittsburgh. The roads haven't changed that much. So I always like to bunch battlefields together to tell a story. There's just so many to choose from virtually anywhere you go. Even in the Pennsylvania Wilds region, battles are much smaller, raids are much smaller, but 1779, there was a campaign out of Fort Pitt against the Iroquois in New York. There's an engagement along what is today Route 62 at a place called Thompson's Island. It lasted about 20 minutes by Daniel Broadhead against the Seneca. But that's a battlefield as much as anything is. So I would always say, go to the big battlefields to start, and then invariably someone you talk to there can point you to the smaller ones that kind of rotated around it, and you'll get a bigger picture that way.
And there's a couple that are military related but aren't battlefields, like when you think of Valley Forge, which is such a wonderful park to be able to explore the hiking and the trails, and being able to see the different information signs is so phenomenal. I just finally went there for the first time this past year and really enjoyed it. Being able to rent like an e-bike and kind of going around and driving around and seeing all the different monuments, I thought was really interesting. And then another one in the Eastern PA is Washington's Crossing State Park. It's already it's in its name. I just spoke to somebody planning a trip there, and it's one of those places you go in, you learn so much about obviously the big moment that happened, and then you can also walk along the river and be able to look at some of the older houses that have been rehabbed and go through some of the gardens and stuff like that. It's a really great place to go if you're not necessarily battle centric, but you still want to learn a little bit about your where you're from.
I would also throw Lancaster
Mm-hmm.
into that story because a lot of people don't realize, when you look at the big cities of colonial America, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, these are import-export cities. That's how they made their money. They didn't make things there. They just shipped things there. Lancaster was in colonial America, where we built things.
Mm-hmm.
So the Conestoga wagon comes from that region. The Pennsylvania long rifle, which many of us still hunt with to this day, comes from that region. In fact, most Americans got their rifle from Pennsylvania. And those wagons and those guns were made by German carpenters and black and gunsmiths and they were really the finest builders of the New World. These are the people Benjamin Franklin didn't want coming in. And my
Yeah.
gosh, look how they changed America.
Yeah. How much they
wow,
contribute.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. So I mean, even put Lancaster to that, not a battlefield, but culturally, as significant as anywhere else.
Even after the American Revolution was over, Pennsylvanians still had some fight left in them. What happened during the Whiskey Rebellion?
Well, I've told this story probably 1,000 times in the last year. I had a book come out on the Whiskey Rebellion, which went to #1 on Amazon for 5 weeks. It was in the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. There was something about this story that resonated with people. But essentially, the Whiskey Rebellion comes out of the American Revolution because everyone who participates are Revolutionary War veterans. And it gets back to that year of blood, 1782. These people are being attacked. Homes are decimated. Loved ones are taken captive. They're begging for help from the Continental Congress and from George Washington, and they get none. So what this builds is this sense of, number one, we have to defend ourselves because help isn't coming. And number two, a lot of these frontiersmen realize that, they don't maybe love the government because the government doesn't love them. So a few years later, um, the Indian War subsides but doesn't go away. Violence becomes more infrequent. Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary, creates what's called an excise tax. That's a tax on a domestically produced good here in America. First one ever. And it's on whiskey. And whiskey is really, for a lot of these farmers in the West, the only thing they make that allows them to have an income of any sort. So they already are very displeased with the government, to say the least. And then they get a tax on a good that to them made no sense. The government has nothing to do with this. And it really snowballed into many of these men falling back into their original Revolutionary War regiments, which a lot of people don't realize. My research has shown that. And they pick up the same rifles they fought the revolution with. And they say, we fought one war against a tyrannical government and unjust taxes. We'll just do it again. It would be really nice if America separated from Britain and the story became clean and neat, but it just wasn't that way. These things have lingering aftershocks. And that's what the Whiskey Rebellion was. And it ends with these rebels trying to sack Pittsburgh, the most important city of the entire Western frontier, not just Pennsylvania. And President Washington reads the Constitution, says he's commander in chief. He sees that, and he actually leads the army west himself to suppress the rebellion. It's the only time in American history a commander in chief has ever led an army in the field. I don't think we're going to see Donald Trump in an F-16 anytime soon, or any modern president. You're right. It'd be absurd for a modern president to go to the battlefield, but Washington didn't know any otherwise. So that's what it said, and that's what he did. So it's really the greatest crisis of his presidency, and it's one that really kind of revealed where America was in the 1790s.
Yeah, just the fact of being able to fight a war and go, all right, good, no tyrannical government, no ridiculous taxes. And then something like this comes out and you're like, what are we doing, guys? We just did this.
Immediately, right? Immediately. Yeah. These are the same men. And the army that Washington led were 17 and 18-year-old men. They didn't fight in the revolution. They were greenhorns, the rebels were the patriot veterans. So it's a very messy affair because we want to celebrate them for being heroes of the revolution. But 10 years later, they try to break this republic apart. They try to secede from the Union. and actually join the Spanish Empire, which Washington was able to stop.
We talk about battles throughout history, and even if we're just talking about some of the earlier fights before the Civil War, are there battle sites in Pennsylvania that people drive past every day and they have no idea what's actually there?
I think most of them, I think if you're on the turnpike, they're pretty well marked. We always see that brown sign. I know you get excited about, I do too. It means there's a park nearby.
Yep.
But a lot of the really good battles are off the beaten path. Why didn't they why didn't they have these battles closer to I-76? I always like joke. But you have to get off and find them. So some of my favorite historic sites that are kind of out of the way, James Buchanan's birthplace. Yeah, but you would never know there was a major historically significant event in that area. Then you find a pyramid in the forest, and you think, oh my gosh, this is like one of the most incredible things I've ever seen. So these battles do kind of sneak up on you, and still a lot of them. Look at, for example, the Civil War. I know I'm talking a lot about the 18th century. Battles like Hunterstown was the far edge of the Battle of Gettysburg. It was a cavalry battle. That's still a little small town uh, that you would never kind of bring into the orbit of the Gettysburg battlefield. Robert E. Lee's retreat from Gettysburg. You could follow that as an entire driving tour itself, and every one of these little towns, it was like one long fight. It's a long, skinny battlefield over dozens of miles because the retreat from Gettysburg was sort of chasing the Confederates back south. All kind of places like that.
That's why I love historical markers so much. You see those blue and yellow signs, and it takes everything in my body, not on a daily commute or a drive around where I don't stop and have to read them. But I'm so glad they're always there. I actually bought a book that's just historical markers in Pennsylvania to catch the ones that I might not be able to stop and read at. Those are really great opportunities. I've seen them so often describing the walking perches, what you talked about before. And if you weren't taught that, or maybe moved here and you didn't learn a lot about Pennsylvania, those are really great kind of options to be able to learn about something quickly to then put on your phone and be like, oh, I'm gonna read more about that later.
Yeah, those are great, and they're sort of the first social media in a way, right? Where you have to say a lot in a little bit of space. And those signs do a great job of that. The PHMC, actually, that's the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. I do a lot of work with them. They've got a crop of new signs coming out. So there's always something to look forward to, I think. And the more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned.
I'm such a nerd. That makes me so pumped.
Yeah.
While it didn't take place in Pennsylvania, the Battle of Lake Erie was pivotal in the War of 1812. What should we know about this naval battle?
So the War of 1812 is a very tricky war. Most Americans couldn't tell you why it started or how it ended, but it was essentially a political war of opportunity for President James Madison. He was facing re-election. He believed Canada was available for the taking. He said conquering it would be just a mere matter of marching. America had close to, at that point, 8 million people. There were only 100,000 people total in Canada. And that included men, women, and children and the elderly. So it should have been an easy fight. As it turned out, the Canadians didn't want to be invaded, and they fought pretty hard. So for the first few years of the War of 1812, we're losing a lot of battles, and in a pretty humiliating fashion. Again, the British are still allied with the natives of the Great Lakes, and they are absolutely demolishing us out there. So we need some kind of victory. And they will call upon Oliver Hazard Perry, Commodore in the American Navy, to fight on the Great Lakes. Now, understand the British at this point are the most powerful empire on earth. We are not even close. And their strongest asset is their Navy. So Oliver Hazard Perry will kind of put out an all points bulletin in Erie, Pennsylvania. We're going to actually need to build several ships to even fight these guys. Like we don't even have ships on the Great Lakes, essentially. He has to build a small fleet of ships from scratch. Luckily, Western Pennsylvania, Central Pennsylvania, you have nothing up there but timber and people that work really hard. And they answer the call. Most of the people that build those ships are Pennsylvanians. And they will travel to Presque Isle Bay. They'll build Perry's ships. He will sail into, again, the kind of Ohio portion of Lake Erie near Put-in Bay, and he'll fight them. And we make it a very glorious affair. The reality was, the British sailors he was fighting were actually in pretty bad shape. One historian described that battle as the sick fighting the hungry, is basically what it was. But Perry does win, and it's like a much needed win politically for Madison because we had very little to speak of. And Perry writes this amazing letter, famous, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." I mean, it's one of the great mic drops in history. But that's kind of puts it in context a little bit. But even though the fight wasn't in Pennsylvania, I mean, our men built the ships, they crewed the ships. Many of Perry's men were free people of color. I think that's really important to note as well. So it's a very Pennsylvania centric story, and it's why we have the flagship Niagara in Erie, PA today.
And you could also learn a little bit more because there's the Perry Monument on Presque Isle State Park.
Yes.
One of those really awesome, unique state parks. It's Pennsylvania's only quote unquote seashore. It's a really great opportunity to be able to see the progress of time over how that area was able to be built because the sea wants to take everything. So how it was moved and how it's changed. The Tom Ridge Environmental Education Center has some information about, which is really good. And I think Erie has like a maritime museum. That's also, if you want to learn more about that, that's one of those cool opportunities.
And Presque Isle, it's an example. People go there for all kinds of reasons. Play on the beach, steelhead fishing, salmon fishing. It takes 5 minutes to stop and read a marker. And you don't historically marker, and you don't know what that's going to do. That could change your life. That could open up your mind to something you never thought about. Who was here before me? What amazing things happened here. And that's what the parks bring. And there's something for everybody, and you can really cherry pick what you want to focus on.
Is the War of 1812 where we got "Don't Give Up the Ship"?
Don't Give Up the Ship. That was on Oliver Hazard Perry's one of the ships in his fleet, yeah. And they saved that flag from a ship as it went down.
The Civil War plunged the nation into war with itself. Before we get to the Battle of Gettysburg, how was Pennsylvania involved in the Civil War?
Pennsylvania is literally at the center of everything in the Civil War. The Civil War should be always thought about as, if you want to make it easy, a war of rivers and railroads, because you had to move troops and supplies. So anytime you had a major railroad junction or a major river confluence, there was going to be a battle there because that's how you won the war. Harrisburg had, I think, 21 major railroads go through it. I mean, it wasn't like a junction of two railroads. It was 21. So literally all of our supplies, north, south, east, and west for the Union Army went through Harrisburg. And that's what made Pennsylvania so key. The other sort of, I suppose, value to it was the Declaration of Independence was written there. Pennsylvania had a special significance to Americans. And Robert E. Lee believed if you could take Pennsylvania, you could maybe destroy Harrisburg, disable the entire railroad network of the Union Army. There's probably some symbolic value to capturing a place like Philadelphia. The other thing about it was, and a lot of people don't realize this, if you're in anywhere really from the mountains, right? So we talked about Fort Loudon. If you cross over the mountains, anywhere between the Appalachian Mountains and the Susquehanna River, there's sort of a triangle there of space. That was really Confederate territory. Most of those people were more pro-Confederate than pro-Union between the mountains and the river. And that was because for the last 100 years, whenever they wanted to ship the goods they grew there, the farming goods they grew there, they couldn't take it over the mountains to Pittsburgh. That was laborious and expensive. They didn't want to pay to ferry it across the Susquehanna to Philadelphia. So most of those people in that triangle just shipped it down south to Baltimore and DC. And that really caused like a fusion of culture with the South there. And if you're driving across Pennsylvania, which I do all the time and you do as well, you will notice that as soon as you move either across the Susquehanna or across the Appalachian Mountains into that triangle, you start to see not Eagles flags and not Steelers flags, but you see Ravens, and you pick up DC and Baltimore radio stations, and those people have retained that, I think, loyalty to Maryland. We don't even think about it today, but for me as a historian, I go crazy when I see it because I know what that is.
Yeah.
I mean, we are still these people, but there is like that triangle of sort of Chesapeake culture there, and this all tied into why Pennsylvania was an attractive target for the Southerners.
Is there a story about something that took place in Pennsylvania during the Civil War that you think more people should know about?
Well, when Robert E. Lee invades Pennsylvania, the Civil War is still deeply political today. We don't have these arguments about the Revolution, uh, about statues and things like that, because we sort of have digested it. But the Civil War, we're still working on, I think, and we still take sides and things still get heated. But when Robert E. Lee invaded Pennsylvania, part of the reason he did it was because most of the fighting of the war had been in the South, especially Virginia, and farms were decimated and no one had food, and Pennsylvania was just abundantly rich with grain and cattle and all the fruit and vegetables, and he wanted his army to feast in Pennsylvania. But one of the things that Lee did, and all the sources talk about this, I'm not talking about one or two throwaway sources, they all talk about this, was that he told his men, if you encounter a black man or a black woman, you take them captive. And as Robert E. Lee's army marched to Gettysburg and then back south after he was defeated, he had close to 800 to 1,000 Pennsylvanians in chains, people that were either escaped enslaved or had never been enslaved. These were free Pennsylvanians. Entire black communities were annihilated by Lee's army, and he took them south to sell them into slavery. I mean, this he literally trafficked free Pennsylvanians out of Pennsylvania as the spoils of war. Because again, one person, and we hate to say this, but it's the best analogy I have in terms of how do you put a financial value on a human? As horrible as that sounds, it was like a new car today, $30,000-$40,000 for a person. And Lee saw all those men, women, and children, free Pennsylvanians, and he kidnapped them. And we give him a pass for that. Historically, I don't. Most historians don't. But we always talk about Lee comes to Pennsylvania and steals, crops, but he leaves an IOU. They always tell that story. Oh, we're Southern gentlemen. We'll pay you back. What about the hundreds of people he kidnapped and enslaved? So that's a story I want to get out there. I think it's too important not to.
I think that's great that you brought that up. I was recently at Gettysburg going through the museum, and they do a really great job of demonstrating the absolute panic blacks felt when they were approaching, when the Southern Army was approaching, and they were just like, I have to run, I have to get out of here. These are law-abiding citizens, store owners, farmers that have to stop everything they're doing because they're so terrified they're about to become a slave that they have to escape with their family. I mean, it's horrible.
And if they were taken south and sold, again, the paper trail, and that's very difficult. I mean, there's a chance they never see their family again.
Yeah.
They get a new name, they get sent down to Mississippi or Alabama, and that's it for them. It's a nightmare of a situation that I think needs more light shed on it.
Taking place in 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg was a critical moment in the war. What made this battle so important at the time?
Well, it was really part of Lee's grand strategy to win the war. Lee will try to mimic what George Washington did in the American Revolution. Washington's strategy, he knew the British were bigger and stronger and more powerful. He knew he couldn't defeat them militarily, but he also knew Britain was a democracy. So Washington's plan was to make the war long and painful and seemingly endless, but get a major victory in an election year, which he did. Yorktown was 1781. In 1782, the British people vote to end this war. They vote for a new government to come in and just make peace. For Lee, it was the same strategy. His target was the 1864 presidential elections. He wanted Lincoln voted out because he believed if Lincoln was voted out, whoever was voted in would make peace with the South. So he had a whole bunch of victories in 61 and 62. That wasn't going to help him in 2 years. He needed a victory in the North, because there weren't really many battles up north. There were some, but not many, that would scare people. And by scare them, I mean demand Lincoln be voted out. So Lee invaded Pennsylvania in the summer of 63 to try and shake up the North, let them feel the pain of the war. And the goal was, again, get Lincoln voted out in 64.
Are there any personal stories or firsthand accounts from soldiers at Gettysburg that stand out to you the most?
I mean, the thing about the Civil War, and again, my primary research field is the 18th century, the 1700s, is that things are very different in Pennsylvania when that war happens. After the war, everybody writes a memoir. Everybody either collects their letters or publishes their letters. So we just get these like incredible stories out of it. Um, a friend of mine, Tom McMillan, he's written a lot about the Battle of Gettysburg. He wrote a book called Gettysburg Rebels, and it was about a family that supported the Confederacy. And at the beginning of the war, they actually went south to fight in the Confederate Army, and they lived in Gettysburg. And of course, as you can imagine, they come back to Gettysburg as Southerners to fight. I mean, it's stories like that abound in that battle because I mean, it was such a huge moment. And after the war, everybody wanted to be there. Even if they weren't at Gettysburg, people claimed to have fought there for that reason.
And plus, at the days after, I mean, people were called because they had thousands of bodies to bury, and then people were just showing up almost as tourists, like, look what happened.
Oh, they were there. Yes, for sure. They had to see it.
Yeah.
A gruesome spectacle, thousands dead, but I think they understood like people are going to remember this. And I want to say I was there.
How would you recommend people explore Gettysburg National Military Park if they're not interested in troop movements and battle lines?
Yeah. Gettysburg, if you are a X's and O's person, you could spend weeks there. Some people even move there. But I think what's really important about Gettysburg is as a resource, it's really amazing. I think, the battle happens in July. So if you can get there in July, you can feel the heat and it's terrible. But I think Gettysburg is one of the most beautiful places in the wintertime. It's quiet and it's solemn. And if you get like decent snow, there's outdoor snow activities you can do there, and that gets you onto the battlefield by yourself, which is really rare. Because if you go in July, it's and this is a good thing. It's just a sea of humanity. So that's what I would say. I mean, go off season and the trees will be, dropping their leaves. You'll be able to see different parts of the battlefield more. They're wonderful hiking trails, biking. It's just laced with concrete sidewalks. There's a lot of activities you can do there. I always say that if you're going to take the kids, if it's going to be a family trip, which I think is obligatory for Pennsylvanians, 2 days to me is more than enough. Again, I could spend a month there, but the kids tire out and the wife runs out of patience. So, 2 days to me, you do everything you want to do, get your ice cream, see a little of the countryside, and then that's, you're probably good. At day three, you kind of seen everything at that point.
Yeah, I bet. Are there little known sites in Pennsylvania tied to the Civil War that deserve more recognition?
I believe there's a lot. We have, I did a show on the Pennsylvania Cable Network called Battlefield Pennsylvania. These are all on YouTube now. We have 50 episodes. Just search for my name, Brady Crytzer, and you'll find them. The Gettysburg campaign had 18 battles associated with it besides the main 3-day battle. And these are all over Pennsylvania. The furthest western battle or engagement of any kind was outside of Bedford. You have just within a day's drive of the battlefield itself, again, 17 others. Hanover, Pennsylvania had a pretty significant battle in it. A lot of different train depots. Hanover Junction had a significant battle. York, my gosh, was occupied by the Confederacy in the lead up to that battle. There was a battle at Gettysburg before the Battle of Gettysburg. It was much smaller, but it was there. Cashtown. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Wrightsville, Columbia Wrightsville, the bridge, the America's longest covered bridge and one of the longest in the world is burned. And this is all before Gettysburg. In Pittsburgh, people actually thought Lee was coming here because no one in Pennsylvania knew where he was going. And in a panic, the city of Pittsburgh shut down all businesses and they actually built about 36 earthen forts all around the city. Because again, a huge percentage of the Union Army's munitions, guns, cannons, powder, and ball came from Pittsburgh. And that was a logical to them striking point. In the coal fields, kind of Jim Thorpe and that region, Lee did have plans to go to those coal fields and set the mines on fire. Because again, that powered the trains, which powered the Union Army. And those fires would still be burning today. I mean, we know the Centralia story, right? That would still be happening if he set those anthracite coal mines on fire. So there's just throw a stone out that way. You'll find something associated with that campaign.
Can you talk about how these battles influence Pennsylvania's identity or sense of place afterward?
I think Pennsylvanians rightfully took pride in not just the Civil War and the participation in the Civil War, but in really all the wars leading up to that too. And the Civil War kind of cemented that. You know, if you go to the Battle of Gettysburg today, there's monuments everywhere. They started putting up monuments literally within 2 years of the end of the battle. The biggest and grandest of all is the Pennsylvania Monument. And nobody complained about that. Nobody said, hey, your monument's too big. New Jersey didn't complain about it. New York never griped about it because everyone understood this is a Pennsylvania battle with Pennsylvania troops, and Pennsylvania played such a critical role in it, winning the war. So I think it certainly cemented in the minds of the people the role we played. And remember, for a lot of the early history of the Commonwealth, we were very disunified. Ethnically, we separated ourselves off. William Penn invited so many people here, but they didn't really live amongst each other. They kind of isolated themselves. To this day, you know, the Amish and Mennonites, they still in Lancaster. I was just there for vacation this year. You know, they still haven't assimilated, and that's their choice, into the larger world, but they are the original enclave from the 18th century. So Pennsylvania, I think after the Civil War, people realized, hey, we all fought the same, we all died the same. You know, these differences are important, but something bigger has come forward. And I think that's what carried them into the 20th century.
If you had to turn one of these Pennsylvania battles from any era into a movie or a Netflix series, which would it be and why?
Oh boy. I honestly would say, you know, there's been a lot of French and Indian War documentaries and films because George Washington was so important. Obviously, Gettysburg had a full-length feature film. Yeah, I would say it would be the Whiskey Rebellion. And I don't say that because, you know, of my own research in it, but it is so important. Everyone thinks America is divided between North and South, and that's true, but that comes later. We were really divided between East and West. I mean, the Whiskey Rebellion could have been the first Civil War. Well, the Revolution would have been that, but it could have been a major first Civil War with us as a republic. I mean, we were really teetering on the edge of that. So I would selfishly probably say that one. But I do believe that story is just so important.
So if somebody wanted to option your book, you're totally fine with that.
That's my yeah. I didn't want to say that, Christian. I wasn't going to say that, but you said it.
What's one story from a Pennsylvania battle that you think everyone should know about, even if they hate history?
I think time and again, it should be something that focuses on President or future President, then General George Washington. Um, the obstacles he faced and the decisions he had to make were dramatic. I always say if we don't have him, we probably all have different passports today. He never had enough men. He never had enough supplies. He never had enough money. He was not an effective battlefield leader. He probably wasn't in the top five best battlefield commanders in his own army, but he had this big picture understanding of the war. He had a wisdom about himself that, yeah, honestly, I don't even know that he recognized, but the decisions he made are what made everything else possible. You know, George Washington never believed he was good enough for any of the positions he got. He was a very insecure man. He always had, I mean, self-doubts plagued him, and that happens to all of us. I think he's a good example, you know, for us to follow. When he was offered to become the leader of the Continental Army in 75, he wrote that he didn't think he was the man for the job. You know, at best, he was a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia. These British had 40 and 50-year combat veterans as generals, but he took the job. And same with the presidency. You know, he didn't believe he was, I mean, amazing. Think about that. George Washington didn't believe he was good enough. It's okay if you feel that way too, but you persevere, you push through, and you'll surprise yourself. And if not for his perseverance, you know, this is a very different world, I think.
Brady, where can people go to purchase your books?
You can find them, you know, wherever books are sold. Obviously, Amazon is kind of the new world we live in, so they're there, but they're also in bookstores. Um, you know, anywhere you want. Like I said, I do have a YouTube channel with over 100 videos if you're interested in a lot of Pennsylvania history. I have 8 books that study the colonial period and Pennsylvania history at large. I'm on a few different series on Fox Nation, Blood on the Bridge, The Battles of Lexington and Concord with Kelsey Grammer, George Washington, Rise of a Revolutionary is airing on there as well. I'm on a show called Outlaws and Lawmen with Sean Hannity. Every Sunday night, I host the Journal of the American Revolutions podcast. So I'm not hard to find. But go to, find me, track me down any social media, send me a message. I'm always looking to chat about history for sure, as you could probably tell.
Brady, thanks so much for talking to us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Christian.
I want to thank my guest Brady Crytzer for joining the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Meta for more information about upcoming episodes. You can support the podcast by buying merch at hemlockstohellbenders.com, or you can click support the show in the podcast description to provide a monthly donation. This has been Hemlocks to Hellbenders. I'll see you out there. Hosting, production, and editing by Christian Alexanderson. Music by John Sauer. Graphics by Matt Davis.